Our first question is from Katherine, and it's a question about what to do when you feel like fellow citizens are kind of betraying the values of your society, when fellow citizens are doing something bad to the sacred places and the sacred rituals of your democracy. And Katherine gives an example, which I'm not going to take up because I want to go broader. And in fact, I'm open to speaking to all sides in the example that Katherine gives. So Katherine, you say, last winter we had our own unique version of January 6th here in Canada. It was much less violent, wasn't violent at all in fact, but it shut down borders, stopped the flow of goods, blockaded downtown Ottawa with big tractor trailers, and made life miserable by blaring horns incessantly for weeks for the citizens of the capital city. I'm not going to take this example up, partly because it would require a separate analysis to make of the truckers. But more importantly, I'm not going to take it on because for the purposes of this chat, I'm passionate about the idea that it's important to try and not frame conflicts in our society in terms of us versus them. And of course, we should frame things in terms of us versus them, and we should throw tomatoes on our political opponents. But we also should take time to not do that and not frame things in terms of us and them, and instead look at the underlying worries, the underlying pulls that act on all of us, to which we then respond in different ways, and then end up in various kinds of dynamics with many kinds of us's and many kinds of thems. And so you ask, Katherine, do you have any advice on how we can reclaim our flag for those of us who value our democracy, who feel our identity as Canadians has been defiled? How do we individuals help to heal the division these events have inflicted? Well, I'm going to speak abstractly and in a way that applies to you, Katherine, in fact, no more than it might apply to the truckers themselves. And I think we've got to start by saying a little of how we might align emotionally about this. And when I say that, I don't mean that I'm going to tell you how I feel about it emotionally and want you to feel the same, not at all. But I want to put a few objects on the table that you can then make your own, as it were, and put those into you, not the ones that I put on the table, because it's so important that we don't tell each other what we should feel. And after that, I think we should probably say a bit about what it means for democracies to slide and how to perceive that slide if and when it's happening. But first, let's align a bit. I think the first thing I want us to align on is the thought that people come to the table of politics from very different places, very different backgrounds, very different beliefs and issues and challenges and limitations. And so we don't get to choose who we share the table of politics with. We just share it with our citizens as a kind of given. And it's not a place to sit around with people we like. It's a place to sit around with people we don't like and even people we don't trust. And there is a culture now in North America and in parts of Europe which says that you can sort of opt out of that table of politics. And in fact, that you can sort of cancel people at that table of politics who you don't like. And that's a really serious mistake because we can't. What we can do is just close our eyes or get up and walk away from the table of politics. But that won't stop these other people who we don't like at the table of politics still sitting there and still going on with whatever it is they're doing. And so there isn't a way to opt out. There isn't a way to stop what's going on in a particular room by closing the door to that room. And so there is a kind of a painful truth here that politics is conflict, that politics is discomfort. And so that's one kind of a form of alignment. I think the second thing I'd say that's quite a bit more positive is that democracy is not incompatible with crisis. And just because your democracy is in crisis does not mean your democracy is going to die. We've lived in the West, I think, through a period of relative peace and tranquility in the 90s and in the early noughties. Now, there's so much to criticize about our societies in that period. But in relative historical terms, that was a lucky period. And we're out of that period, and there is no way to go back to it. And in that period, we might have become rather unused to bumps, to turbulence, to stormy waters. And I always say that our democracies are now coming out of the bay and getting de-anchored, and they're going out into open ocean. But they're seaworthy. They're not going to sink, but it's going to be bumpy. So just because your democracy is in crisis does not mean that your democracy is a goner. Crisis is in some ways even a natural state for democracy if we look at the history of democracy. And that's an important optimistic lesson that is actually less available to us than it should be, because we've been in the bay and we haven't experienced the bumps out at sea for enough time to realize, oh, okay, this is not good, but we're not going down either. So I think the third thing I would say is that it's important to reflect on positive things, on democratic regeneration. And that might mean whatever it means for you. There are different ways for us to regenerate our democracies. And even if one's a pessimist and one feels that the decline will always run ahead of the regeneration, that's my prediction for the next couple of decades. But even if you feel that, you can always regenerate more, And one way to think about regeneration is to think about local politics, to think about people being connected with the political process, people touching it constructively, even if it's not in an ideological or party political way, even if it's about either participating or supporting others participating, or thinking about the idea of people participating in something local, like, for instance, reconnecting your local community a bit more with the supply chain that brings their food to them, and bring it about that more local shops, local stores contain local produce, So thoughts of democratic healing and democratic regeneration and that kind of exploration is always really important. And then the fourth thing that I think is really important is that if you reflect on something that happened in your democracy and you reflected on it honestly without BSing yourself, and you have reflected on it steadily, in other words, it's not just something you thought on a Tuesday night, but you thought of it on one Tuesday night and you seem to think and feel the same way the next Tuesday night and the Tuesday night after. So if with that level of stability you do feel that something that's happened in your democracy is a kind of violation of something sacred, then it's really important that you allow yourself to feel that and don't allow people to tell you, oh no, get over yourself, it was not as bad as you think. Because you see, there is an element of the sacred to democracy. There are sacred spaces in democracy, just like there are sacred spaces with religions. Sacred spaces in democracy are institutional spaces, parliaments, sometimes courts. And then there are notional spaces, which are really the rituals and practices, often informal, of democratic procedure. And when we violate those, it can feel like something sacred is being violated. And one of the worrying things about these kinds of violations is that to some degree they could be irreversible. Because once you, as it were, put your hand and shake about or push over something sacred, it might be impossible to then put that sacred thing back up convincingly with everybody still believing in it the way they did before. So that business of something sacred in democracy being violated is real. And if you honestly feel that about something that your political opponents have done, let yourself feel that, and don't let people tell you that you're being over dramatic. And that's a bit about alignment, but I think we should also say something about that process of watching democratic decline and recognizing even when it's happening. So let's say a bit about that. So where do we go if Western democracy begins to decline? What are we looking at? Because we're not looking at Canada becoming Belarus overnight. I think what we're looking at aren't the truly autocratic regimes with elements of totalitarianism. We're looking at something like Hungary, or at least Hungary a couple of years ago, because Hungary keep getting worse. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like a situation where there aren't elements of totalitarianism. There aren't elements of the monopoly over organized violence being used to just take away political opponents in the middle of the night. And it's not a situation where elections are cancelled or simply faked. It's rather a situation where everything is stacked in favor of the folks in power because they have stifled the checks and balances on their power. They have stifled the counter-majoritarian institutions, the courts, the media, the universities. Viktor Orban threw the Central European University out of Hungary. And that way it makes it very difficult to kick these guys out. And then these guys also have a mosquito problem. And then these guys also have a situation where they become crooks and thieves. So these are kleptocracies. So on top of this kind of majoritarian messaging that these regimes typically do, where they say, well, we're focusing on the majority, and then these minorities, well, they're kind of outsiders and we shouldn't like them much, and maybe they are responsible for some of the harms we're experiencing. But on top of that, they create a class that's a kleptocracy that is sort of sufficiently advantaged by the regime that it's not easy for it to challenge it. And moreover, it's sufficiently kleptocratic for it to know that it's screwed if the regime collapses. So there's a kind of a succession crisis in these regimes, because as soon as you replace not just Putin, but Orban, as soon as you replace Orban with transparent democratic politics, what happens? Well, a lot of the folks in that bubble at the top might need to go to jail. So that's the kind of situation we're looking, and we should identify politicians who are trending in that direction, and particularly identify politicians who are both trending in that direction and are strategic and competent. This is an important point, because at the moment we are, for better or worse, living through the age of the populist buffoon. And these are often people who are spectacularly gifted at communication, but aren't that strategic or effective at undermining democracy behind closed doors. Well, of course, they are effective to some degree. So that's the kind of thing you look for. You look for counter-majoritarian institutions being muzzled, stifled, diminished. And if and when you see that happening, you've got to call it out. And what's difficult about calling it out? Well, so many things are difficult about it, but one thing that's difficult about calling this process out is that the best way to call it out is to have journalistic institutions do it who are in a position to speak to the entire population. Has America, for instance, got an institution like that? No. It hasn't. And increasingly, Western countries are losing institutions like this. Institutions that speak not just to one side or one segment or set of segments of the population, but institutions that speak to all citizens. And that's why what often happens when there is an anti-democratic political process, an anti-democratic political candidate, it's actually impossible to explain that that's what's going on to the totality of the citizenry. So that's a tiny bit, Katherine, but I actually think Sherrill's question, which is next and is about expertise, also speaks directly to your concerns too. So let's jump to Sherrill. Sherrill asks, look, I've come across a common problem through somebody in my world who doesn't trust experts. And it's this problem, this tendency to disbelieve everyone after a rather superficial engagement with them. My friend rather quickly decided that people that I considered have far more knowledge on Russia and Ukraine, Masha Gessin, Fiona Hill, Timothy Snyder, are just talking heads, commentators, which she hates, which apparently, Sherrill, your friend, agrees that they get the facts right. So that's already really impressive. Facts only there, and therefore these people can be brushed aside in their judgments of what is happening. Well, it's impressive that there's some convergence on facts. That's not common either. I find this disdain for experts in their fields bordering on conspiratorial thinking, in which everything anyone says is suspect regardless of their lived experience and knowledge on the ground. Can you comment on this phenomenon? Well, I think in one of my videos on the main channel, I've said that there's a tendency, in fact, I've quoted the philosopher Bernard Williams talking about this, there's a tendency in our culture to get so suspicious that you're being duped that you begin to let go of the idea that there's any such thing as getting it right at all. And some people go down that rabbit hole at the level of giving up even on all facts, and some people stick to accepting facts but go down that rabbit hole when it comes to interpretations. Any interpretation that's offered to them they think is, just dubious, bogus, or a matter of some kind of institution speaking to them via the intermediary of some talking head which shouldn't be trusted. But I think that in these waters, it's perhaps worth saying a little bit, Sherrill, about the marketplace of ideas and what kind of a thing that is. On the rare occasions when one is, sitting at dinner next to some kind of American entrepreneur, one often hears conversation about the marketplace of ideas. So let's say a couple of things about it, and these might be challenging things. First of all, you can take the idea of the marketplace of ideas literally, that it's a market in which ideas are sold and bought in the form of books and YouTube videos. You might take it a little bit more metaphorically and think of it as really about a marketplace of ideas that proceeds not in terms of things being sold and bought, but in terms of ideas being accepted. Now, markets can be free, markets can be constrained. So we can talk about a marketplace of ideas, but we also have to talk about what constraints it comes with. Now, if you have a completely unconstrained marketplace of ideas, that might be something that's really important in many areas of society. But it's certainly naive to think, as many people do, as many libertarians do, and really many people in the United States do. I think this belief is a little bit less pervasive in Canada than in the States, but it's pervasive everywhere in the West, really. The idea that if you allow ideas to be freely expressed and just float around everywhere in vast quantities, some stuff will rise to the top. Well, truth won't rise to the top that way. A free market of ideas will certainly not give you truth. And there is something else that's really important in these waters, and that's that investigating an idea more deeply, first of all, will often lead to you ignoring other ideas and other areas of inquiry and understanding where you might become progressively superficial while going into this narrow investigation of some one thing that you're connected with. But even more importantly than that, that very one thing you're investigating might not be something you understand better at the end of your investigation than at the beginning. You might understand it worse. What if you do flat earth research? What if you do tempo research in classical music of the kind that the YouTuber Wim Winters does? And Wim is a musician of some talent, but he has this extraordinary idea that everything should be played roughly twice as slow as the great composers seemingly wanted it to be played. And that in fact, if we think about it deeply enough, we'll understand that they really wanted everything to be played twice as slowly. And so he plays pieces at an unrecognizably slow tempo and has created this online bubble, really, where there's a small community of people who think they're doing tempo research. Well, the more they do tempo research, the more delusional they become about our relationship with Mozart and Beethoven and so on. So the idea that a citizen spends more time on researching a topic isn't connected with the idea of a citizen developing a better view on that topic. That sounds brutal, but it's true. Why? Because the epistemic virtues, yes, the kind of habits, the kind of intellectual skills and talents that make you more likely to get things right don't just develop by you practicing more. Unfortunately, this is not like riding a bike, where however you do it, you're just going to be better if you're on the bike. No. And that's why we've got a lot of independent researchers during the pandemic who all say a series of various kinds of incompatible and mostly false things, you know? So what does that mean? Well, it means that the marketplaces of ideas that genuinely work best are spectacularly coercive markets. And even these coercive markets often fail. But at its best, when it's institutionally pure enough, the scientific process is an example of a marketplace of ideas that is quite coercive and has a consistent track record of getting a lot of things accumulatively right. But it's an extremely weird and coercive structure. You know, it's a structure that will often ostracize people who are right, but are right about something that is so antithetical to the current state of research that it can't be accepted until research itself gets to that place. You know? It's an inherently conservative process, an inherently restrained process with lots of levers, where the final aim isn't that everybody gets to speak, but that almost nobody should be allowed to speak, except the people who, in speaking, are most likely to make sure, to give us the possibility to make sure that the ideas that really matter get spoken. That's the aim. Not that everybody speaks, but that the ideas that and the concepts, the constructions, the claims that really matter get expressed. So that's, I think, a little bit on the marketplace of ideas. What about something very basic and psychological here? This is something I really believe with people who just don't trust, you know, something that perhaps they should trust. It's got to come from inside their, if you like, motivational environment. It's got to be something that they themselves feel motivated to move toward. It does not work very well to just blast somebody into a direction in which they don't want to go. So it's about creating an environment always, I feel, of intimacy, where you're not imposing your view on the other person, but you're creating intimacy, creating trust, including creating trust for the other person around how you acquire your ideas, and then some of the way you acquire your ideas might then rub off on them, rather than it being the case that you just say, boom, 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 you're wrong about this, and you're unfair about that, and Timothy Snyder is great, and how dare you not rate him, and so on. So that's not an adequate answer, but it's a bit of an answer. I hope it was of at least moderate value. The next two questions are from Broni about Julian Assange and the activist journalist John Pilger, who has been doing a little bit of indirect Putin fancying, which is uncool. So I'll just say something a bit off-button about both Broni and everybody else, if that's okay. So it'll be a kind of a guide to where I stand on this, rather than a proper analysis, but I hope it's going to be of some value. Broni asks, as far as Assange goes, I don't agree with his extradition. However, I also feel that he's been the victim of his own ego. I am concerned about the implications for free speech, but I also feel just a bit of cognitive dissonance about this. I'm conflicted. But that's something I have to be okay with, I suppose, if I'm going to continue to learn and be a critical thinker. So, I don't know Julian personally, but people in my life do know Julian. I am on his side as far as his case goes, but I don't like him. I find him a destructive narcissist. And if you wanted a view that's close to mine about Julian, then you could look up the view of the ex-editor of the Guardian newspaper in the UK, Alan Rusbridger, who has a very dense and challenging relationship, of course, with Julian Assange. I've had conversations with this. So there's a very beautiful man. There's a lot of beautiful people in Assange's life. There's a beautiful man called Vaughan Smith. And Vaughan is the founder of the Frontline Club in the UK, which is one of the most remarkable journalistic institutions there are. And I think around 2010, Vaughan offered Assange refuge in his country house, where Assange was effectively for a long time under house arrest. And Vaughan also put up a surety for Assange's process. And there's hardly a more decent and lovable man full of integrity that I've ever come across in my life than Vaughan. And I think that there are a lot of people close to Assange who are tempted to think, well, look, yes, Julian's got plenty of issues, but look at what he's been through. Who wouldn't have issues after all of that? I don't agree. I think that we have a story of a bit of egomania and narcissism right from the beginning there. But I think it's important to separate the personality from the key issues at hand. And so there's obviously going to be a way to do that. And I recommend that one in many ways supports Assange's case. And certainly as a citizen of the UK, I'm not impressed that this kind of a weird empire, which is a marvelous and mellifluous empire in many ways, the American empire, but it's an empire, and it's coming and just picking a person out of my sovereign territory. And I'm not impressed. And you know, if other countries did that, we would be up in arms. So I'm not impressed with this process. And I am in many dimensions supportive of Assange's case. And if you want my balanced views, I would suggest something like the perspective that on many public occasions Alan Rusbridger has given. But let's move to your second question, Broni. Well, John Pilger is a hero in many people's houses, and there are people with profound integrity and a profound sense of social justice who idolize Pilger. But so Broni, you sent me an interview with Pilger where he says all kinds of things I'm not going to critique, but inadequate and unacceptable things about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you just say, I don't know if you have time for this or even the stomach for it, but I've liked some of the things Pilger's been up to in the past, but I was personally absolutely appalled by this one. What is going on? What would you say about the fact that he's just going on saying things which there's no evidence? And yeah, I mean, he's doing a lot of sort of Putin truthing, and he did quite a bit of Syria truthing. And recently, Pilger has had a consistent record of saying things that are both false and are things that are peddled by the Russian government or the Syrian government, for instance. I can't comment cumulatively on the achievements of his career. I would again separate the personal from the professional here, but suggest that there's also a big overlap between the two. It doesn't mean you can't separate them, but they're connected. But here is what I'd say about the personal. And I can't say it because, again, I don't know John Pilger personally. Somebody very close to me in a past life was many, many past lives ago, very close to John Pilger. And I don't have a good impression of him. And other people in my life who've been in the same room as Pilger but didn't know him very closely also said things that are negative. And these are people who, in these particular cases, have all been left-wing, human rights loving people. But it's stuff like, John may be the most instantaneously dislikable human I've ever come across on planet Earth. That's not an uncommon thing to people to say about John. So that plays a role, I would say, in how we get to some of the unlovely historical and political and geopolitical conclusions. I don't want to get into that, but I'm very comfortable to say that no, John is truthing in the truther sense about the Russian perspective of the Ukraine invasion, but he's not truthing in the truthfulness sense that in this community that we tend to love. Thanks so much, everybody.